an original.
From Story Studio Network.
I'm Tom Hoppe, and I'm your host of the Most Painful Podcast. On this podcast, we've provided you with the best evidence-based information to help you with your quality of life. Over the last number of seasons, we discussed how health can impact each person or gender differently. In episode 1 of season 6, we spoke to Dr. Jeffrey Mogil about the importance of preclinical pain research. During the interview, Jeff touched on the gender differences in rats used for pain research. Today, we have Dr. Jeffrey Mogil back on the show to discuss gender differences in their preclinical pain research. Jeff, welcome back to the show.
Thanks, Tom. Nice to be back.
So I know we had talked about last time, as I said, on the first episode of this season 6, and you had raised that your lab had started to understand the differences in how pain impacted gender in rats. Is that correct?
It's correct, although let me clear up some nomenclature.
Okay.
So it's very unlikely that rats and mice, my lab mostly studies mice, by the way, and
Okay.
It's very unlikely that they have gender. It's not impossible, but that hasn't been proved, and it would kind of depend on your definition of gender anyway. In general, sex is the word for things that are biological and have continued through evolution. And so what mice have is sex differences. Gender is a sociocultural construction. So gender is behaviors of organisms living in societies. And so again, rats and mice do live in groups. It's possible there's gender there. But it's very likely that what they have is sex. And of course, in humans, if there is a difference between men and women, it could be gender or it could be sex. And it's really hard to tell the difference between the two because, of course, gender builds upon sex. Gender is just sex embedded in a society. So let's start with that.
All right. Well, thank you for correcting me.
And of course, there are both. So we know a lot of sex differences between males and females, and we're starting to learn that in addition to those sex differences, there are purely gender differences between men and women.
Okay. So maybe you can just kind of review what preclinical research is really quickly, because I want to get into what you talked about with the mice that you're studying and how the different sexes react to pain. Is that correct?
Sure, but why don't we start with humans, because there's important things to be said there too before we take the discussion to mice and rats.
Okay.
The first question, of course, that people always ask, the major question in this field, is the question of who's more sensitive to pain, men or women. And here's what we know. First thing is that women are the clear majority of pain patients. Probably about 70% of active pain patients at any one time around the world are women. And that could be because women are more sensitive to pain than men, but there are a lot of other possible explanations. One of them, which is almost certainly true, is that women are much more likely to go to the doctor, or more accurately, men are much less likely to go to the doctor. And if you don't go to a doctor, you can't become a patient. And so it's possible that part of the reason why women are the majority of pain patients is nothing more than women are more likely to seek medical assistance than men are. And that, of course, would be a gender difference, right? There's no sex there. That's something about how people were raised and societal expectations, et cetera, et cetera. Okay, but it's also possible that women are more often pain patients because they're more sensitive to pain. So maybe a better way of looking at it is to do broad surveys of the population and ask them not if they're a pain patient, but ask them if they endorse having the symptoms of pain. And this has been done 20, 30, 40 times in the world, large epidemiological surveys in different countries. And they regularly find, in fact, I did a review of this a few years ago and found that every epidemiological study but one found that women were more likely to endorse having pain than men. Right? So if you ask, are you in pain somewhere in your body? Women are more likely to say yes, and men are more likely to say no, by about 5 to 10%. So again, maybe that's because women are more sensitive to pain than men. But here again, there's still another possibility, which is maybe women are more likely to get diseases that feature pain as a symptom, right? And it has nothing to do with pain sensitivity at all. So the best way to answer the question is to take men and women into the lab and give them controlled experimental stimuli, heat or cold or pressure or electrical, and see who's more sensitive to pain. And this has been done 300 or 400 times. There are 300 or 400 studies that have reported differences between men and women to experimental stimuli. And some people look at the literature and say that it's contradictory because sometimes these studies find statistically significant differences between men and women, and sometimes they don't. Okay. But that could simply be because the studies that don't find the difference don't have enough statistical power to show the difference. That is to say, they were too small a study to find the difference. So we did an analysis of all these studies a few years ago, and we simply said, forget about the issue of statistics. Just look at every study and say, okay, in that study, were the men more sensitive to pain or the women more sensitive to pain? And once we did this analysis, it's incredibly one-sided. It doesn't matter what type of pain you're talking about. It doesn't matter how you measure that pain. Women almost always had more sensitivity to pain, less tolerance of pain than men did. It's really one of the most obvious analyses that I've ever run. And so in my mind, this question has been answered as clearly as any question in biology. Women are more sensitive to pain than men. Now, we can quibble about by how much, and is that enough to matter? And of course, the big question is why. But that question, in fact, has been answered. And what's interesting about that answer is that it is opposite to what everyone guesses, right? If you ask people on the streets, are men or women more sensitive to pain? First of all, the funny thing is everyone will guess. And we almost always guess that it's going to be men that are more sensitive to pain and women more tolerant of pain because women give birth. But it turns out that the science goes the other way.
That's interesting because that's exactly my thought too, because I haven't really dug deep into it. So being honest, I don't know. And it's exactly that. We do hear that, well, because they give childbirth, which is very painful. So they must have a higher tolerance to pain. But you're saying the studies are not showing that at all?
No, dramatically not, which is lovely. One of the things I like most about science is when science is counterintuitive and goes against common sense. That's
yes.
If common sense worked all the time, then we wouldn't need science, would we?
No, we wouldn't. We wouldn't. And we wouldn't need a podcast like this either. Okay, how does that now translate, I guess, to what you're doing? Or maybe you want to start, I guess, when we spoke last time, you said, hey, we were the first ones to kind of discover this. Maybe I'll let you decide where you want to start with that question.
Sure. So where mice fit in to all this is if we have come to the conclusion that women are more sensitive to pain than men, then the question is why? Okay. And there are some explanations that are purely gender-based. Right. So, for example, there are gender role expectations that we're all familiar with. And there's evidence that right from early age, if a baby boy is in pain and if a baby girl is in pain, they're treated differently by their parents, their grandparents, and strangers. Right. The girls are allowed to express the pain. And the boys are told not to, right? Big boys don't cry is a real thing, and it persists in the world. And if that's what you learned when you were a baby boy, well, you wouldn't report having pain, right? You'd want to minimize it. And if you were a baby girl, grow into a woman, you would be okay with expressing that pain. So it's possible that the difference we see is a gender difference, but it's also possible that it's a sex difference. And if you show differences between male and female rats and male and female mice, as I said, since they very likely do not have gender, then that means there really is a sex difference in mice. And if there's a sex difference in mice, there's probably a sex difference in people as well. Now, at this point, I also need to say that there are two types of sex difference, and one of them is much more interesting than the other. The first type of sex difference is what I call a quantitative sex difference. So that is simply the observation, like I just described, that a particular type of female mouse might be more sensitive to a particular type of pain than the same strain of male mouse. Okay, so if you found that the females were a little bit more sensitive to, let's say, heat pain than the males, then that would be a quantitative sex difference. And there are plenty of those in the mouse and the rat literature. But more importantly than that, there are also qualitative sex differences, which is when scientists come up with evidence that a particular gene or a particular brain area, particular protein, a particular cell type even, is involved in pain processing in one sex, but not the other sex. And that's the amazing thing that is happening very recently in preclinical pain research, is that we are finding that there are all these preclinical qualitative sex differences whereby male mice and female mice, they both have pain, they're both doing pain processing, but the way they do the processing, the elements that are involved, the genes and the cell types that are involved in making the perception in the brain, are radically different between males and females. And we didn't know this until very recently, because until very recently, everyone, almost all scientists, 80% or more of pain research studies were using male mice only or male rats only. But there were a few people like me, for reasons I can tell you about if you're interested in, that have been using both sexes for a long, long time. And those of us that have been saying, wait a minute, there are sex differences here. Very recently, funding agencies around the world, Canada was in 2006, the US was in 2016, have changed their rules, essentially forcing preclinical researchers to use male and female animals, and male and female cell lines for that matter, in their research. And suddenly, lo and behold, everyone is finding sex differences. Pandora's box has been opened, and every week or two, there's a new study showing that this particular gene or this particular protein is involved in pain in males but not females, or females but not males.
So why, it might be a simple question to answer. So why was that most people were using just male mice?
Part of it is just simple inertia. They were using males because they were taught to use males by their, advisors who use males, who were taught to use males from their advisors, right? There's a lot of inertia in science. Scientists are really, really stubborn and resistant to change. I've always been shocked by that. It's inertia backed up by an expectation that's actually perfectly reasonable, just turns out not to be true. So that expectation is that if you use male animals, you are free from circulating hormones, making your data messier, right? So everyone was worried that if they use females, well, the females could be in this phase of their estrous cycle. Mice and rats have an estrous cycle instead of a menstrual cycle. And, they could be at this phase or they could be at that phase. And depending on when you tested them, that would add variability. And so your data would be messier, so you would be forced to use more animals, which would cost more money. Okay, that's what everyone was worried about. And it's reasonable. The problem is it's just not true. So we looked for pain way back in 2003, I think. And since then, other people have looked across the biomedical literature, and it is simply not the case that data obtained using female rats or female mice is any more variable than data obtained using male mice or rats. So there's no problem here. There's nothing to worry about. It's just that a lot of people never got the memo, right? They simply never read those papers. And so they didn't learn that fact until they were forced to learn it by the funding agencies changing their policies.
So science helps the scientists.
I guess so.
Yeah, right. So, because I mean, as a person just not involved in that, I would think, who cares if they're going through a cycle? I mean, that's life, right? So wouldn't you want to know really what's going on? What's happening? And I get it would mess the data. I get that portion. But from I guess looking at a question, I would want to know, because that's how life is, right? So
we talked about this the last time, but this is another example of scientists having the wrong incentives, right? You would imagine that we would incentivize to get down to the root of the problem and figure it out, and do what matters in the real world. But that is not at all how we're incentivized. We're incentivized to publish as many papers as cheaply as possible. That's how we're incentivized, right?
So maybe that needs to be looked at and changed, hopefully one day, right?
100%.
Yeah. I mean, because otherwise, are we just spinning our wheels? I don't know. So what else have you found out from that? So you've been doing this for a long time, and you said, okay, well, I'm going to ask you why you were the person doing it. Was it because cost, availability? Did you had a different view? Why were you the one who decided to focus on both sexes when you research?
As these things go, it was complete and random chance. So I happened to go to grad school in a lab where money was tight, and to save money, we bred our own mice. And if we had a bit more money, we would have done what most people do, which is buy their mice from commercial suppliers. Okay. And when you buy your mice from commercial suppliers, you can buy whatever you want. And what people wanted was males. And so that's what they were sold. Okay. But when you breed your own mice in your own lab, right, half of the offspring are going to be females. And it is not only wasteful, but just horrifyingly unethical to get rid of those females. And so we did all our experiments on males and females. We didn't think it mattered, but we had males and females, and that was one of the things I wrote down. In addition to the weight of the animal, I wrote down the sex of the animal, just, for complete record keeping. And this was the first experiment I was ever involved in as a graduate student. And one day I'm killing time in the late afternoon because I'm meeting people at a bar. And I decided to run a statistical analysis. Now, we'd already run the simple analysis to show that the drug we were working on was having an effect. Okay. And I decided, okay, I'm going to run the so-called two-way ANOVA and look to see the effect of drug and sex at the same time. Now, this was long enough ago that statistical analysis on a Mac SE computer took about 7 or 8 minutes. But I had 7 or 8 minutes to kill, so I sat while it churned it out, and I found that this moderate drug effect we thought we had was actually a complete drug effect in the male mice and absolutely nothing in the female mice at all. Right? So we had a perfect interaction between drug and sex. Our drug was working in the males, wasn't working at all in the females. So I got excited about that. And the next morning, the postdoctoral fellow who was in charge of this experiment comes in the morning, and I excitedly tell him about this interaction between drug and sex. And here's what he said to me, and he was only half kidding. He said, and I quote, "Sex differences are to enjoy, not to study." And then he proceeded for the next 20 minutes or so to try to talk me into forgetting I had ever run that analysis. Why? Because I had taken something that we could explain and turned it into something that we could not explain. So how were we going to write the paper? And he was like, forget you ever did it. We don't care about sex. This study is about the drug. Just forget it. And fortunately for my career, I didn't listen to him. I actually thought the sex difference part was a lot more interesting than the drug effect. And through the rest of my career, although I can't really say I've gone out looking for sex differences, I've always put myself in a position to find them if they're there. So I always have equal numbers of male and female mice, and I always run that two-way ANOVA to see if whatever it is we're studying is the same or different in male and female animals. And it turns out that there are sex differences about a third of the time. And so about a third of the studies I've published are on sex differences. None of them I was looking for. All of them I found by accident, if you will, but by putting myself in a position to find them if in fact they were there.
Yeah, which is interesting because, I mean, even now, if we look in the human side, you know, how they're talking the different symptoms for men and women when it comes to something as simple as a heart attack.
Absolutely.
And how that's changed, you know.
By the way, one thing that's interesting about the human situation is that, you know, things have changed on the preclinical side. We are now forced to use male and female animals in our research. Now, human research used to be done all on men as well, because everyone was afraid that maybe the woman is pregnant, it's going to hurt the baby, that sort of thing. But in 1993, at least in the United States, the NIH forced researchers to use both men and women in their studies. Okay. And since then, essentially all human research is done with both men and women. But here's the interesting part. Although men and women are in the study, only 50% of the time, maybe even a little bit less than 50% of the time, do the researchers ever look to see whether whatever it is they're studying is the same in the men versus the women. That is, they don't run the two-way ANOVA. They don't look for the interaction. And so there may be lots of sex differences in human studies that we don't even know about because the authors actually never looked to see if they were there.
That's interesting because one would just assume, right? I mean, as a person who's not involved in doing that, I would just assume, well, now that you have males and females, you would look at the differences between the two and how they present in whatever studying you're doing. But I guess not.
I would assume that too, but it's not there. And of course, the other thing that's really not there is any analysis of gender. You know, sometimes people don't even ask what the gender is of the participants in their study. They usually ask, what sex were you assigned at birth, right? Male, female, intersex. What they don't ask until very, very recently is, you know, what is your self-identified gender? And look to see whether that makes a difference for whatever it is people are studying.
Wow. That's a lot. I mean, I've been involved in research projects, obviously not medical ones, but more on the social side. And you know, there's a requirement from the funder to, like you said, females, males, and gender. But it's interesting that you say that people aren't looking at the effects that it has on both individually.
We're working on it. It's just a matter of raising awareness. And frankly, you know, the thing I've been doing to my preclinical colleagues for a number of decades now, which is why, you know, maybe I'm not the most popular pain scientist in the world, is I've been shaming them, right? I mean, they'll publish a paper only using males, and I'll come along a few years later and publish another paper saying, actually, you're right, this was true in males. Guess what? It's not true in females. Females do it a completely different way. And, you know, I like to think that shame is a pretty good motivator. So I hope this has helped. But hopefully just by raising awareness with enough scientists and the public, which can put indirectly pressure on scientists, I think this situation is going to get better.
Yeah, and it should, right? I mean, gosh, it's been going on for a long time, right? So how long ago was it when you first discovered that and you were told to disregard? How many years ago was that?
That would have been in 1989.
So, and we're still dealing with it in 2025.
Yeah.
Seriously, you know?
We are. So I did an analysis of the literature recently. And so as recently as 2015, 80% of published preclinical studies were done in male myso rats only. By 2019, that had improved to 50% of studies. But in my mind, the right number is 0.
Yeah.
Right? Every study should be using both males and females unless you're studying prostate cancer pain or something.
Yeah, obviously.
But, essentially all studies should be using both sexes, and now only half of them are. So there's been an improvement, but we have a long way to go.
Yeah, just like I say, as a person who's not doing what you're doing, and I'm just a curious type of person, it just boggles my mind that, I don't know, to me it's common sense, right? You have two different sexes. Just look at it. I don't know,
Yeah.
How hard is it? Right. Anyways, is there any final thoughts that you have?
No, only to, remind people to watch this space, because the evidence is growing so overwhelming that males are processing pain in one way and females are processing pain in another, that the clear prediction from this is one of these days, I don't know when exactly, but one of these days, a treatment for pain, a pill probably, is going to be approved, but it's only going to be approved for use in one sex and not the other, because it's simply not going to work in the other sex. And that's going to be an interesting day, because there's no example of that in biomedicine yet. There have been some drugs that have been approved for one sex and not the other, based on how many men and women they had in the clinical trial and issues of statistical power. But I'm talking about something more than that, something where the prediction from the beginning is that this drug will work in men, not women, or women, not men. One last thing to say is that we may have already had an example of that. So it turns out that the new class of CGRP drugs for migraine, they were approved for both sexes because the drug companies didn't look to see, they didn't do this analysis by sex that I've been talking about. But some academics did, and they found that, in fact, these CGRP drugs work in female migraineurs, but not male migraineurs. And had the study been in only male migraineurs, it would have failed. And had the study had more male migraineurs, it would have failed. The only reason those studies succeeded and these drugs got approved is because so many more migraineurs are women than men, that in those clinical trials, most of the participants were women, the population where these drugs actually work.
The whole thing's just interesting. That just could lead to another discussion, which I probably won't say on the air, but it's just how people get tunnel visioned, right?
Oh, yeah.
Right? Very smart, intelligent people, and we all just get tunnel vision. Oh, I'm guilty of it as well. We just get tunnel vision, and we don't see the trees through the forest.
That is a big problem. It's a big problem with scientists, and it's a big problem with preclinical scientists, especially, right? We're reductionists. That's what we do for a living. And when you become a reductionist, you're very interested in the trees, and you lose complete sight of the forest.
Well, it's been an interesting talk, and thanks for educating me today. I'm walking away just shaking my head. Also walking away with some positivity that it is changing. So a little bit of both. For feedback about the show or more information on chronic pain, you can visit our website, veteranschronicpain.ca, or follow us on Facebook and X at Chronic Pain COE, and on Instagram at chronicpain_COE. To the audience, stay safe and keep the hope alive.
The Most Painful Podcast is produced for the Chronic Pain Center of Excellence by Story Studio Network.